Hello and welcome to this revision video for Living Under Nazi Rule, and this is how to answer question number 7. Okay, so in terms of question 7 for Living Under Nazi Rule, you will be given a set of 3 sources / interpretations that are all focused on a specific topic or inquiry. You will need to analyse the ways in which they are useful to a historian studying a specific question. So this is the question that we're going to look at in this video. Question 7. How useful are sources B, C and interpretation D for an historian studying the establishment of the Nazi dictatorship between January and July 1933? In your answer, refer to the 2 sources and the interpretation as well as your own knowledge. Now this question is worth 15 marks. So the first thing to really emphasise here in decoding the question is that the question is asking you about how useful the sources and interpretations are. So you need to be able to think about what a historian could learn about the establishment of the Nazi dictatorship between January and July 1933 by studying these sources and interpretations. So the first thing you really need to consider is what is the inquiry, if you like, that the historian is looking into, and then make sure you are explaining how the sources or indeed the interpretation can help answer that inquiry. In this case, studying the establishment of the Nazi dictatorship between January and July 1933. Now, in this answer, you do not need to compare the sources and interpretations, and therefore, in terms of the structure of your answer, you are going to include a paragraph on each one. There is no need for an overall conclusion to compare the sources and the interpretation. So a checklist for this question, you're going to read the source carefully and then you're going to highlight which parts would be useful for a historian in finding out about the establishment of the Nazi dictatorship between January and July 1933. Try and think about what would be useful about the content of the source or the interpretation, and try and think about what would be useful about the provenance of the source or interpretation. For each source, judge how useful it would be. So use phrases like "this would be helpful because," you can use phrases like "its use could be limited by the fact that," but try to focus on the ways in which the source is useful rather than focusing too much on limitations of the source or interpretation. Okay, so we're going to start off by looking at source B. So source B is the image and headline from a Nazi newspaper published on the 1st of March 1933. The words have been translated in English below. So the provenance is there at the top, and then you can see the content, and the content says, "Now we will take ruthless steps. Communists set Reichstag alight. Communist arsonists arrested. Signs of a communist uprising. Increased measures against the terrorists. All communist MPs arrested, and all communist newspapers banned." So what you need to do is read the interpretation, well, the source carefully, and as you read it, highlight and annotate anything that would help the historian to understand the establishment of the Nazi dictatorship between January and July 1933. So in this case, we can focus on the fact that, and this is where your own knowledge comes in, understanding that this is about the Reichstag fire, which took place on the 27th of February 1933, and you can pick out things like the language that is used, calling the communists things like terrorists, and just make sure you avoid these errors. Don't say things like source is biased, so it's not useful. And when you're writing about interpretations, don't write that the interpretation was written a long time after the event, so it can't be accurate as the historian was not there. That's very generic and simple analysis and won't get you any marks. Okay, so we're going to have a look at an example answer for source B. Now, you don't have to write as much as we've written here. And the guide here is that you need to think about what's useful about the content and what's useful about the provenance, but you don't absolutely have to write about both. Basically, what you need to be able to do is make a sensible evaluation of how useful the source is. But remember to focus mainly on the ways in which the source is useful. There's no real requirement to say lots about limitations, although you can bring this in where relevant. So let's have a look at the example answer. Now note how we use the word useful throughout, and we use phrases like, for example, a historian could infer or a historian could conclude that, and that just makes sure we're really focused on the question. So, source B is very useful for showing us how the Nazis took advantage of the Reichstag fire to arrest communists. At this stage, in March 1933, the Nazis were not in complete control of Germany, so this source is useful for helping a historian understand how the Nazis set about establishing their dictatorship by arresting communists and increasing measures against the communists, such as the Reichstag fire decree. In addition, a historian could infer from the headline of "Now we will take ruthless steps" that the Nazis saw this event as the spark to bring in emergency measures and crush the communist opposition. This is true, as the Nazis did arrest communists and Marinus van der Lubbe was eventually executed. The study of the provenance is highly useful, as it shows us how the Nazis' purpose was to portray the communists in a negative way. The use of emotive language, such as describing the communists as terrorists, is useful for showing a historian how the Nazis' purpose was to negatively portray the communists and encourage others in Germany to support Nazi actions against the communists. The source was produced to be read by the wider German population and to justify their actions against the communists. Therefore, a historian could conclude that the Nazis used newspapers and propaganda to establish the Nazi dictatorship, making the source really useful. Okay, so we're going to look at source C. So the provenance is an extract from an article entitled "A Walk Through Dachau Concentration Camp," published in a local German newspaper in June 1933. And the content reads: "The former Dachau powder factory has become a modern camp for political prisoners. Where grass and weeds once grew, neat paths have now been laid. We visited a row of barracks, and everywhere we saw the same picture: cleanliness, order, light, and air. The prisoners work gladly and willingly, and most of them are probably happy to have an orderly life, good food, and a roof over their heads. For those unclean people who oppose the Nazi Volk community, one term hangs over their head like a looming sword: concentration camp." So as I've read this, I've highlighted some key phrases which I may then go back and write about in my answer. And that's all about things that would help a historian to understand the establishment of the Nazi dictatorship between January and July 1933. So this one is clearly a focus on how the Nazis used concentration camps to control people and establish their dictatorship. But also we can make some conclusions about the purpose, in that they are trying to portray the concentration camps as quite different to how they actually were, which might make us conclude that they're still trying to get the support of the German people, and in fact they might not be all powerful. So let's have a look at an example answer for source C. So again, we're writing about content and provenance for this example answer, and it's more detailed than it would need to be. So content and provenance is really what you want to think about, and particularly when you're looking at provenance, really try and hone in on the purpose behind the source. So source C's content is useful for showing us how in 1933 the Nazis were using concentration camps to get rid of their opposition and establish a dictatorship. The political prisoners who have opposed the Nazi Volk community have been put to work, which shows how the Nazis were getting rid of opposition to establish their dictatorship and putting opponents in concentration camps. The provenance of source C is very useful to a historian, as we can tell the source's purpose is to whitewash the camps and convince the public they were necessary places. This is clearly a staged visit to the camp. It says the camp is light and airy, and the prisoners were treated well, which we know from our own knowledge is misleading. This is very useful to the inquiry, as it tells us how propaganda was used in setting up the dictatorship. It was not all through violence. It also shows us the purpose was to justify their actions, suggesting the Nazis were not fully in charge at this time. Okay, so the third from the set is usually an interpretation. Okay, so interpretation D here is an extract from a book by historian Ian Kershaw in 2008 entitled Hitler. So that's the provenance. We're going to read the content now. And as you read the content, you want to be highlighting and really thinking about, okay, so how would this interpretation help a historian understand the establishment of the Nazi dictatorship between January and July 33? So let's read it. Goebbels prepared another spectacular for the 1st of May, when the Nazi Party created a day of national labour. Over 10 million people turned out, though for many a factory worker, attendance was scarcely voluntary. The following day, the SA occupied the offices and bank branches of the trade union movement, confiscated its funds and arrested its people. In a matter of days, its members had been incorporated into the massive German Labour Front, the DAF, founded on the 10th of May under Robert Lay's leadership. The once mighty Social Democratic Party of Germany, the largest labour movement that Europe had known, was also at an end. So as you read, you're going to highlight anything that would be helpful. One of the things to think about here, though, when you've got an interpretation is just make sure you're always making a sensible judgment about usefulness. So avoid the generic, this interpretation is not useful as written a long time after the event analysis. That won't get you any marks. If you know the historian or can conclude something from the book title, then that's fine. So it might be worth, for example, recognising the fact that Ian Kershaw is a highly respected historian of Nazi Germany. And similarly, it might be worth stressing that his book is entitled Hitler, and therefore he may perhaps be focused more on Hitler's power and leadership, and that might make him really focus on that angle of things in his interpretation. We'll look at that in the example answer. Okay, so here's an example answer for interpretation D. Let's read it. Interpretation D's content is highly useful because it tells us how the Nazis used a mix of both propaganda with the Day of National Labour, mixed with forced control, attendance was scarcely voluntary, to establish their dictatorship. A historian could understand how they took away the rights of workers by getting rid of trade unions. The use of the phrase, the once mighty Social Democratic Party, being at an end in terms of its power, underpins the significance of this event, which would be useful to a historian for judging the importance of this event. The provenance is highly useful. The historian Ian Kershaw is a highly respected historian and will base his interpretation on many sources. However, as he is writing about Hitler, he may perhaps overemphasize the importance of and power of both Hitler and the Nazis at this stage. One of the things you might find out for the interpretations is it can be quite difficult to say lots of sensible things about provenance, so don't just guess things. But if you do know something about Ian Kershaw and you conclude something from the book title, then that is an example of some relevant analysis of the provenance of an interpretation. But it is fine just to focus on the content if you can't think about anything relevant. As we said before, avoid those generic analyses in terms of it was written a long time after the event, it's written in 2008, so maybe there's been some more sources that have come out. That kind of analysis is not going to get you any marks. Okay, so you've just listened to a guide there on how to answer question 7 for living under Nazi rule. So 3 takeaways: decode the question, be clear on the inquiry the historian is looking into, explain how useful the source would be by looking at the content and or provenance, in particular purpose as well. And remember, 1 paragraph for each source and interpretation. There is no comparison required between the interpretations and no overall conclusion is necessary. Thanks very much for listening. Goodbye.